In the mid-15th century, within the quiet austerity of a Franciscan hermitage in Calabria, Francis of Paola gained a reputation not for spectacle, but for spiritual clarity. A man whose words carried unusual weight when spoken about rulers, power, and the fragile limits of kingship. Francis lived far from courts, yet princes sought him. His withdrawal from politics made his voice more credible, as if distance sharpened vision. By the 1460s, reports circulated that he spoke of kings not as masters of history, but as men answerable to it. His early statements about royal authority were not framed as predictions. They emerged during counsel, prayer, and silence, often spoken reluctantly. Those present later recalled that Francis described future outcomes with calm inevitability, never urgency, as though observing a path already unfolding beyond human correction. In southern Italy, during the late 15th century, Francis emphasized humility before divine order. When nobles asked about dynasties, he redirected attention to moral endurance. Yet embedded within his counsel were remarks that hinted certain crowns would rise briefly, then weaken under pressures they themselves created. These words reached France indirectly, carried by clerics and envoys who sensed their seriousness. Francis did not name kings lightly. When he did, witnesses noted the absence of condemnation. His tone suggested observation rather than warning, as if the future required no persuasion to arrive. By the time of King Louis XI's reign, Francis's reputation had crossed borders. Summoned to France in 1482, he entered a royal world burdened by illness and fear. The contrast between monastic restraint and royal anxiety framed every exchange that followed. At court, Francis spoke sparingly. He offered no reassurance of longevity or victory. Instead, he spoke of succession, continuity, and loss in abstract terms. Later chroniclers would connect these measured statements to events that unfolded across generations of French monarchs. Observers noted that Francis never positioned himself as a prophet. He resisted that title. Yet his remarks about the fragility of royal lines lingered. They were remembered not because they shocked, but because they seemed incomplete, awaiting confirmation by time rather than belief. During the 1480s in France, political stability appeared secured, yet Francis's presence introduced quiet unease. His counsel implied that authority detached from restraint erodes from within. Such ideas resonated slowly, taking decades to reveal their relevance through unforeseen royal misfortunes. This first phase of Francis's association with kings established a pattern. He neither challenged power nor endorsed it. He simply spoke as if history itself were listening, leaving behind statements that would later be re-examined when French crowns began to fracture in unexpected ways. When Francis remained at the French court, attention shifted from curiosity to consequence. His earlier remarks began to be weighed against unfolding realities. Advisors noticed that his language avoided dates, yet emphasized sequence, suggesting that decline follows patterns shaped by moral decisions rather than sudden, arbitrary divine interruption. Illness had weakened King Louis I, and Francis never promised recovery. Instead, he spoke of preparation and transfer, implying that power rarely ends where it begins. After the king's death in 1483, courtiers revisited Francis's words with discomfort, sensing they had misunderstood restraint for vagueness. As Charles VIII ascended the throne, France entered a period of ambition and risk. Francis did not address campaigns directly, yet spoke of rulers who overextend, mistaking momentum for permanence. Later generations would interpret this as a quiet prefiguration of costly decisions made during Charles's Italian expeditions. Witnesses recalled that Francis emphasized lineage not as privilege, but as burden. He described royal inheritance as fragile, easily disrupted by pride or impatience. When Charles VIII died unexpectedly in 1498 without an heir, those earlier conversations resurfaced, now sounding less abstract and more disturbingly precise. Francis's comments regarding succession never celebrated collapse. They carried sorrow, not judgment. He spoke of crowns passing sideways rather than forward, of continuity altered rather than destroyed. This language mirrored the transition to Louis XII, reinforcing the sense that events followed a path Francis had calmly outlined. During Louis XII's reign, France experienced both reform and strain. Francis, by then near death, had already withdrawn from courtly life. Yet his words circulated, especially those noting that temporary stability often conceals deeper fractures, which surface only after a generation believes itself secure. Chroniclers later observed that Francis's statements gained authority only through delay. Nothing occurred immediately. This absence of immediacy preserved credibility. His remarks matured alongside history, becoming clearer as patterns of weakened succession and interrupted royal lines accumulated across the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Unlike popular prophecy, Francis offered no single dramatic fulfillment. Instead, his counsel aligned with a sequence of losses, shortened reigns, and fragile heirs. Each event alone seemed ordinary. Together, they formed a progression that echoed his insistence that decline rarely announces itself with spectacle. The miracle, as remembered by the faithful, lay not in prediction, but in alignment. Francis did not bend events toward his words. His words waited for events. This patience distinguished spiritual insight from ambition, reinforcing trust among those who later compared memory with recorded outcomes. By the early 16th century, Francis's reputation rested on coherence rather than marvel. His observations about kingship appeared less like foresight and more like spiritual diagnosis, revealing how authority, when detached from restraint, unravels predictably, leaving history to confirm what silence had already implied. After Francis of Paola died in 1507, memory rather than spectacle preserved his words. Monastic records, court recollections, and later chroniclers treated his counsel cautiously, noting that significance emerged gradually as successive French reigns reflected patterns he described without ever claiming prophetic authority. Within the order of minims, Francis was remembered less for kings than for discipline. Yet his encounters with royalty remained part of communal memory, retold quietly as examples of how spiritual clarity can observe power honestly, without either flattering it or seeking influence. As the 16th century progressed, French historians revisited transitions of the crown. They did not frame Francis as a predictor, but as a witness whose language aligned uncannily with later instability. His restraint protected credibility, allowing reflection rather than enthusiasm to shape his posthumous reputation. Church memory preserved these accounts without amplification. No feast day homily exaggerated outcomes. The value lay in coherence, not marvel. Francis's words endured because they fit events without forcing interpretation, inviting trust through proportion and silence rather than theological explanation. Among believers, the significance rested in Francis's posture. He neither feared kings nor elevated them. His approach modeled how sanctity engages authority, calmly, without intimidation or expectation. That demeanor itself became part of the legacy remembered alongside the outcomes later associated with his counsel. French royal history continued to fracture in ways earlier generations could not anticipate. As lines weakened and authority shifted, Francis's statements were recalled not triumphantly, but soberly, reinforcing the sense that spiritual insight often reveals structure, not detail. Within unfolding historical processes, this memory shaped how Francis was venerated. He was not honored as a court prophet, but as a monk whose integrity allowed him to speak plainly. The Church preserved his story as evidence that holiness can engage history without attempting to command it. The miracle attributed to Francis remained understated. It resided in alignment between moral observation and historical outcome, sustained across decades. Such continuity required patience from those remembering him, trusting that meaning matures slowly when not pressed into immediate demonstration. For later faithful observers, Francis's life offered reassurance rather than prediction. His example suggested that divine order does not require constant signs. Sometimes it appears through quiet consistency, leaving space for human freedom while revealing consequences through time instead of proclamation. Thus, Francis of Paola's legacy settled into a measured place within church memory. His words about kings did not dominate history, yet they accompanied it faithfully, leaving behind a calm testimony that power, when observed truthfully, eventually explains itself without persuasion.